So, I want you to imagine a specific sound right now. Just picture it. It starts as this low, steady, almost imperceptible rhythmic heartbeat right in your ears. Like thump, thump, thump.
Yeah, that baseline physiological stress.
Exactly. It feels like the baseline stress of a Tuesday morning before you've even, opened your laptop. You definitely know the feeling.
Oh, absolutely. The inbox is already overflowing, right?
Right. The Slack notifications are pinging, the stakeholders are waiting. But then, right over that steady, pressurized rhythm, there is a sharp, violent crack of breaking glass.
Man, that's an incredibly visceral auditory image to start with.
hmm
It completely resets your expectations of what stress actually sounds like.
It really does. And according to this fascinating cache of notes and transcripts we are unpacking today, that sound, that sudden violent crack, isn't a window breaking in your office.
Right.
It is the exact literal moment a high-level leader hits their absolute breaking point. It's that invisible threshold where the stress stops being something you just manage on a spreadsheet and becomes a structural failure.
Which is terrifying, really.
It is. It's the moment the board of directors walks out, or, the 10 p.m. news cycle suddenly turns hostile against a politician, or maybe the moment a CEO realizes their meticulously crafted resilience plan is just fundamentally empty.
Yeah, the crisis isn't abstract anymore at that point. It's physical. It's like lodged right in their sternum.
Exactly. So, welcome to the deep dive. Whether you are leading a massive team, prepping for a high stakes boardroom presentation, or, you're just insanely curious about how ultra high performers survive immense pressure without imploding, we are so glad you're here.
Definitely.
Today, our mission is to unpack a highly specific, honestly, very unusual leadership framework from a program called the Quiet Arsenal.
And what is genuinely captivating about the curriculum we're looking at today is the specific approach the Quiet Arsenal takes to executive survival. I mean, they are presenting a rigorous 7-part anti-fragile leadership framework.
Right.
But here is the twist, and it's a big one. It is entirely derived from ancient texts.
Yeah, this part blew my mind.
Right. Specifically, they use the King James Version, or KJV, of biblical scripture. The entire foundational premise of this program is to solve incredibly modern executive burnout, which they label spiritual attrition, by mapping it onto these ancient, thousands of years old protocols.
But before we go a single step further into this framework, we really need to lay down a crucial disclaimer for you. It is absolutely vital that you, listening right now, know exactly what the parameters of our discussion are today.
Yes, very important.
In this deep dive, our singular goal is to objectively examine the methodology, the psychology, and the structural framework laid out in these Quiet Arsenal sources. We are not endorsing the religious viewpoints, the theology, or any specific political or spiritual ideology contained in this material.
You're just looking at the data, basically.
Exactly. We are simply acting as your impartial guides here. We are reporting on how this original source material attempts to solve incredibly high-level corporate and political leadership crises using ancient texts.
We're looking strictly at the mechanics of the arguments they make, right? And how they claim those mechanics alter human performance under pressure.
Right. And the stakes of those mechanics are undeniably high. If you're leading a team right now, or honestly, even if you are just managing the chaotic logistics of modern life, you almost certainly recognize the baseline feeling this methodology describes.
Yeah, they call it having output without intake.
Oof. Output without intake, that is such a heavy phrase.
It really is. It's that sensation of running an engine constantly at the red line while the fuel gauge is just, hovering on empty. We're going to explore how the Quiet Arsenal argues that prioritizing a leader's internal character, their spiritual stamina, is vastly more critical to the survival of an organization than external metrics like KPIs.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by looking at their core diagnosis of the fragile leader. From there, the framework demands some surprisingly physical interventions, which we'll unpack.
Yeah, the physical stuff is wild.
It is. Then we have to look at how they mandate radically restructuring a leader's calendar and task management, followed by their micro-habits for emotional regulation. And finally, we'll pull it all together by looking at the specific 7-day tracking sheet they use.
Sounds good.
So let's jump right into this core diagnosis they call spiritual attrition.
Right, so this is where the curriculum builds its entire foundation. They define spiritual attrition not as a sudden catastrophic failure, but as a slow, grinding exhaustion. It's caused by being incredibly busy, but entirely ineffective.
Busy but ineffective, we've all been there.
Oh, absolutely. It's a state where a modern executive is making rapid-fire decisions that might affect thousands of employees, but internally. They are completely depleted.
Like they've got nothing left in the tank.
Exactly, they have lost their baseline piece. And as a direct result of that exhaustion, they slowly begin to lose their moral compass. The texts are very careful to point out a fascinating psychological nuance here, though. This ethical drift isn't because the leader is inherently malicious or corrupt. It's simply because their cognitive and spiritual endurance has eroded to nothing.
Wow. So it's that subtle, almost invisible erosion. Like you don't wake up one day and decide to bankrupt the company.
Right, no one does that.
You make 1,000 tiny compromise decisions because you are just, frankly, too tired to fight for the right one. And to illustrate this exact phenomenon, the methodology leans heavily on a primary historical case study from the book of 1 Kings, chapter 19.
Yeah, the story of the prophet Elijah.
Right.
And this specific narrative is just a masterclass in how the curriculum maps an ancient text directly onto modern executive psychology.
How so?
Well, to understand the whiplash of this story, you have to understand the scale of what Elijah had just accomplished. In the biblical narrative, Elijah has just won a massive, highly public definitive victory on a mountain called Mount Carmel.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So he goes head-to-head with hundreds of rival prophets, calls down literal fire from the sky, and ends a brutal, years-long national drought.
That's huge.
It's massive.
Yeah.
To put it in modern terms, it is the ultimate peak performance moment. It's the absolute equivalent of a tech CEO taking their company public with a record-breaking IPO, or, a politician winning an impossible landslide election.
Right. He is at the absolute apex of his career and influence.
Exactly. But then comes the crash, and it happens almost instantly.
Wait, really? Like right after the victory?
Complete devastating whiplash. Literally the very next day, immediately following this unprecedented triumph, Elijah receives a death threat from the reigning political power, Queen Jezebel.
Okay, but a guy who just called down fire from the sky shouldn't be terrified by a single threat, right?
You would think so.
Yeah.
Rationally, no. But his reaction is total systemic collapse. He completely falls apart.
Oh, wow.
He abandons his post, runs away into the absolute isolation of the wilderness, sits down under a juniper tree, and literally prays for his own death. The text quotes him saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life."
Which, when you look at it through the lens of performance psychology, is wild.
Totally.
You win the single biggest, most consequential battle of your entire life, and 24 hours later, you are sitting under a tree begging to quit everything permanently.
Yeah, it makes no logical sense.
But the framework draws a brutal parallel here to modern executives who experience post-achievement depression. They argue that wanting to quit the day after a massive corporate win or feeling overwhelming dread after closing a big deal isn't a sign of weakness.
Right, it's not incompetence.
Exactly. It's a biological and spiritual symptom of a completely depleted internal battery. The output required for that Mount Carmel victory was so high that the intake was zero. It's a severe lack of spiritual stamina.
And if we zoom out and connect this to the broader picture of organizational health, the curriculum insists on a structural reality that modern business schools, frankly, often ignore.
And what's that?
You cannot build an anti-fragile organization if you have a fragile spirit sitting at the helm. It's a structural impossibility.
Because if the leader breaks, the whole ship sinks.
Exactly. The resilience of the marketing department, the tech startup, or the government office is entirely, inextricably dependent on the internal, unseen endurance of the human being running it.
The methodology uses this phrase that I found incredibly arresting. They talk about leaders deserting your own soul before the battle even starts.
That's a heavy line.
It is. They pull in a reference from Mark 8:36. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? But they aren't just using it as a philosophical platitude,
Right, they apply it to corporate acquisition.
Yeah, exactly. You're so hyper-focused on gaining the market share, dominating the competitor, that the actual core of who you are, your inner man, your baseline integrity, just hollows out entirely.
And that hollowness is precisely what makes the modern executive so brittle. When the organization is hollowed out at the top and the next unpredictable crisis hits, maybe it's a global supply chain collapse or that sudden hostile news cycle, there is zero internal shock absorber left to handle the impact.
It's basically like trying to run a massive complex software update on a smartphone that's hovering at 1% battery.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. Like it doesn't matter how critical that software patch is or how badly the operating system needs it. The hardware is going to crash mid-download because the baseline power simply does not exist to support it.
Exactly.
But taking that analogy a step further, I have to ask, Is this framework suggesting that all massive corporate failures, like a botched products launch or a toxic culture, are fundamentally a personal, spiritual failure of the executive at the top?
Well, the methodology actually makes a brilliant pivot right here. They don't just leave the executive floating in this abstract theological realm of guilt and spiritual blame.
Okay, good.
Yeah, they recognize the hardware problem. They argue forcefully that the very first step to fixing the spirit, to recharging that 1% battery, is not a massive spiritual retreat or a deep psychological audit.
So what is it?
It is actually fixing the physical body. You cannot fix the software until you physically plug the hardware into the wall.
And that pivot leads us directly out of the diagnosis and into the interventions. The very first intervention the curriculum demands is something they call strategy number 7, the Elijah refeed.
Yes.
And when I was reading through the source material, I kept referring to this in my notes as the sleep and steak protocol.
It's a highly accurate shorthand, honestly. And to understand it, we have to look back at Elijah sitting under that juniper tree in 1 Kings chapter 19, specifically verses 5 through 8.
Okay, what happens there?
Well, the framework points out a profound detail. When Elijah is at his absolute psychological breaking point, exhausted, terrified, actively suicidal, the divine response is completely devoid of theological instruction.
Really? No lecture?
None. There is no moralizing. There's no strategic whiteboard session about how to handle Queen Jezebel.
Yeah.
God doesn't demand a renewed vision statement.
An angel literally just gives him a baked cake and tells him to go to sleep, right? The quote is just, arise and eat.
A cake and a nap. It is shockingly pragmatic.
I love that.
The curriculum uses this exact narrative to build a foundational argument. Physical neglect is fundamentally a spiritual issue.
Wow.
The directives in this strategy are incredibly blunt, especially for a high-level executive framework that usually deals in, synergy and optimization.
Yeah, they don't mess around here.
No, they don't. They tell leaders they must actively get off the caffeine and cortisol loop. They mandate the prioritization of deep sleep above almost all other tasks. They specifically instruct the executive to eat real food. The literal phrase in the workbook is grill a steak.
Grill a steak. Amazing.
And to forcefully turn off their cellular devices to halt what they call the adrenaline hijack.
The language they use around sleep deprivation in this material is intense. Like, they don't treat it like a badge of honor the way Silicon Valley hustle culture often does.
Oh, definitely not.
They say explicitly that a sleep-deprived leader is clinically impaired, and they take it a step further, crossing into a moral judgment. The framework calls it an actual sin to attempt to lead a multi-million-dollar organization on only 4 hours of sleep.
Right, a sin.
They aren't calling it a suboptimal workflow. They are assigning moral failure to sleep deprivation.
And the rationale for assigning that moral weight is based on the collateral damage. Think about it. If you are clinically impaired by sheer exhaustion, your executive function degrades. The prefrontal cortex, which handles complex decision-making and impulse control, literally slows down.
So you become reactive.
Exactly. Your emotional regulation vanishes. And as we discussed earlier, your moral compass begins to drift. You become an active liability to the hundreds or thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on your clarity.
That makes a lot of sense.
And the framework views this physical mandate as so vital that it extends directly into their next structural requirement, which is strategy number 2, the Sabbath siege.
Right, the Sabbath siege. The subtitle for this section in the notes is Offense is Rest.
Yes.
The biblical anchor here is Exodus 20.8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. But reading through the application, it becomes immediately clear they aren't just talking about, attending a religious service on a weekend.
Not at all. This is presented as a strict, non-negotiable operational mandate. The curriculum requires one full, continuous 24-hour period every single week with absolute zero work engagement.
Zero.
Zero. No strategic decisions, no answering emails, no checking Slack messages on the toilet, no reviewing cabinet papers or quarterly reports. It is a demand for total, uncompromising disconnection from the mechanism of leadership.
What's genuinely fascinating here is how the framework bridges the ancient text with modern neuroscience.
Yeah, the cognitive recovery aspect.
Right. They point out that what secular neurobiology refers to as cognitive recovery, which is the absolute biological necessity for the brain to rest, clear out amyloid beta plaques, and repair neural pathways, aligns perfectly with this ancient biblical commandment.
And the warning they issue is stark, isn't it?
It is. They say if you do not actively choose to take a Sabbath, your biology will eventually choose one for you, and usually in the form of a catastrophic physiological or mental breakdown.
Which goes right back to the breaking glass down from the beginning.
Exactly. But wait, hold on. Let's look at the reality of this. Offense is rest. Look, if I'm running a political campaign with 3 weeks to go until an election, or I'm a startup founder in the middle of a make-or-break funding round and I completely unplug and ghost my team for a full 24 hours,
Right, it feels impossible.
my board isn't going to call me spiritually resilient. They're going to call me fired. How does this methodology possibly justify the massive operational risk of abandoning the ship for a full day during a crisis?
Well, the friction there is immense, and the curriculum absolutely acknowledges it. The way they justify this extreme disconnect is by reframing the concept of risk itself.
How so?
They view this physical reset not as a luxury vacation, but as baseline survival triage. They are forcing the leader to look at the long game. The statistical risk of an exhausted, sleep-deprived executive making a catastrophic, company-ending decision on a Friday afternoon is vastly higher than the risk of that same executive being offline for 24 hours to recover cognitive function.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
It goes back to the core premise. If the ship sinks because the captain literally collapses at the wheel, it doesn't matter how many late-night emails the captain answered the night before.
Okay, so the hardware is plugged in, the executive has slept, they've eaten a steak, they've taken their 24 hours offline.
Yeah.
The battery is maybe up to 20%. But Monday morning still arrives, and that mountain of Slack messages hasn't moved. The crisis is still waiting on the desk.
Always is.
If they just dive back into the exact same chaotic, reactive workflow, that battery is going to drain right back to 1% by Tuesday afternoon. The physical rest demands a structural change to follow it. They have to fundamentally rethink their task load.
Precisely. The physical reset is purely triage to gain enough cognitive clarity to look at the battlefield. Once the brain is functioning, the framework mandates a radical, almost violent restructuring of the leader's calendar.
Which brings us to the methodology solution for being busy but ineffective.
Right. Strategy number 3, the Gideon audit.
The Gideon audit, subtitled Cut the Fat. This one is aggressive.
It is conceptually brutal. The Gideon audit is anchored in the book of Judges, chapter 7, verse 3. The historical context here is critical. A leader named Gideon is preparing to face a massive, overwhelming enemy army.
Okay.
He has gathered his own Israelite army to fight, but the divine instruction Gideon receives is entirely counterintuitive. He is told he actually has too many men.
Wait, too many men for a massive battle?
Yeah. God instructs Gideon to stand before his troops and announce that anyone who is fearful and afraid should just turn around and go home.
And the text says 22,000 guys just leave.
Just walk away.
They don't fight, they just pack up their tents and walk away from the front line.
Right. Gideon voluntarily decimates his own military force right before a major battle. The Quiet Arsenal framework extracts this narrative and turns it into what they term the send-home principle.
Okay, how does that apply to a CEO?
They argue that modern leaders who are facing overwhelming corporate or political battles need to symbolically send home 22,000 tasks.
Sending home 22,000 tasks. That is a terrifying visual for anyone who lives and dies by their daily to-do list.
It is designed to induce a level of operational shock. The audit specifically targets the administrative clutter, the performative check-in meetings, the micromanagement of lower-level departments, all the peripheral noise that drains a leader's inner strength without actually moving the needle of the organization.
So what are they left with?
The curriculum mandates a weekly, rigorous audit to identify what they call the unique 3. An executive must sit down and identify exactly 3 things that only they can do.
Only them. Not 3 things they're exceptionally good at. Not 3 things they enjoy doing.
Right, exactly.
3 things that, if they do not personally execute them, absolutely no one else in the entire corporate hierarchy has the authority, the vision, or the specific mandate to accomplish.
Exactly. And once those unique 3 are isolated, the mandate becomes ruthless. The executive is instructed to cut, delegate, or entirely cancel everything else on their calendar. You must send the 22,000 other tasks home.
The psychological friction of this audit is what makes it so fascinating. The source notes point out that the hardest part of the Gideon audit isn't figuring out what tasks are bad or wasteful.
No, any competent leader can spot a useless meeting.
Right. The true difficulty is distinguishing between tasks that are good and tasks that are vital.
That distinction is the absolute crux of the Gideon audit. The curriculum explicitly states that an anti-fragile leader must develop the capacity to say no to genuinely good opportunities,
Like what?
like good PR appearances, good secondary passion projects, good networking dinners, because the fundamental law of energy displacement applies. If you say yes to all the good things, your cognitive and spiritual energy is so broadly dissipated that you lack the capacity to say an effective yes to your unique mandate, the vital things that actually ensure survival.
You know, it feels a bit like pruning a prize-winning rose bush.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, if you want a massive, spectacular bloom, you can't just let the bush grow wild in every direction. You actually have to take sharp shears and cut off perfectly healthy, good buds and branches.
Which feels wrong when you're doing it.
It does. You are actively killing healthy parts of the plant so that the main flower gets all the nutrients, water, and energy it needs to survive and thrive.
It's a highly accurate biological comparison, but the methodology frames it even more aggressively than that. It's not just about ensuring the main flower looks nice. It's recognizing that if you don't cut those healthy branches, the entire root system eventually dies from overexertion.
Wow.
It's a matter of structural survival. You are purposefully starving certain areas to ensure maximum impact in the one area that dictates the organization's future. It directly solves the output without intake problem. If your output is spread across 50 minor tasks, you are bleeding out. If your output is hyper-focused on 3 vital tasks, you maintain your stamina.
But let me look at this from the perspective of an actual executive trying to implement this on a Tuesday. We are talking about the CEO of a mid-sized tech company or a hospital administrator dealing with a staffing crisis.
Sure.
Does identifying only 3 unique tasks completely oversimplify the chaotic, complex reality of their jobs? Can a modern executive really just delegate 95% of their daily responsibilities and only focus on 3 things without the whole system falling apart?
It is a profoundly harsh pruning process, I'll admit that.
Right.
And it absolutely flies in the face of modern corporate culture, which practically deifies constant availability and hyper-involvement.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's similar in secular terms to Warren Buffett's famous 5-25 rule. Have you heard of that?
Remind me.
It's where you list your top 25 goals, circle the top 5, and then treat the other 20 as an avoid-at-all-costs list.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The Quiet Arsenal framework argues that if an executive feels they must be intimately involved in 50 different daily tasks, they don't actually have a robust leadership strategy. They have a fragile organizational structure. They are micromanaging a broken system, not leading a healthy one.
Okay. So you do the Gideon audit, you prune the rose bush, you clear out the macro schedule, and you have your pristine, unique 3 tasks.
Right.
But even with a beautifully curated, heavily delegated calendar, you still have to deal with human beings. You still face microstressors. You still have a stakeholder who says something completely out of line in a meeting, or a sudden PR fire that pops up at 2 p.m.
Life still happens, yeah.
Exactly. The macro schedule is clean, but the micro moments are still highly volatile.
And that volatility is exactly where leaders often break, even if their calendar is clean. The reactive mind takes over. To address this, the framework shifts from macro scheduling to micro habits designed for those sudden, high-stress, in-between moments.
Which brings us to strategy number 4, the Nehemiah pause, also known in the workbook as the 2-second prayer.
This micro habit is modeled after the historical account in Nehemiah chapter 2, specifically verse 4.
Set the context for us.
So Nehemiah is a cupbearer standing before Artaxerxes, the most powerful king in the world at the time. The king notices Nehemiah looks sad, which was actually a potentially fatal offense in the presence of a Persian king.
Yikes.
Yeah. And the king asks him a direct, incredibly high-stakes question. For what dost thou make request? The biblical text notes that before Nehemiah answered this life-or-death question, he prayed to the God of heaven.
But the crucial detail here is that he didn't ask the king for a 10-minute recess. He didn't drop to his knees in the middle of the throne room. He was standing right there, looking the king in the eye.
Exactly. It was a micro moment, a tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of time between receiving the external stimulus, the king's terrifying question, and delivering the verbal response. The curriculum labels this the Nehemiah pause, and they prescribe a very specific whispered phrase for modern leaders to use in this identical 2-second window.
Lord, give me lips like a sword. You are literally instructed to whisper this under your breath when you receive a hostile remark in a boardroom, or when an aggressive journalist asks a trap question, or even the moment you read an infuriating passive-aggressive email.
Yes. And the neurobiological goal of this 2-second intervention is profound. By forcing yourself to take a deliberate breath and whisper a specific pre-planned phrase, you are actively attempting to halt what psychologists call the amygdala hijack.
Ah, the amygdala hijack. We have all experienced that physiological cascade. You read the hostile email, your peripheral vision tunnels, your heart rate spikes, your breathing gets shallow,
Yep.
and your fingers are already aggressively typing out a furious reply before your logical thinking brain has even registered what you're doing.
Right. The amygdala, the fear and threat center of the brain, has completely overridden the prefrontal cortex. And what is the outcome of sending that reactive email?
You almost always regret it.
Always. Or you snap verbally at a senior colleague. Or you impulsively fire a vendor in the heat of the moment. The 2-second prayer acts as a physiological circuit breaker. It forces the brain to engage language and intentionality, which pulls blood flow back to the prefrontal cortex.
That's fascinating.
It interrupts the cortisol flood, providing a micro-moment of spiritual and biological intake that prevents a catastrophic reactive outburst.
Let's be entirely realistic for a second, though. We are talking about a literal 2-second pause and a whispered phrase. Can muttering lips like a sword actually change the trajectory of a multi-million-dollar hostile boardroom negotiation?
It sounds too simple, right?
It does. Or is this essentially just a spiritualized placebo? Like, is it just a religious wrapper around the age-old advice to just take a deep breath and count to 3 before you start yelling?
Honestly, whether you approach it purely as a divine spiritual intervention or strictly as a secular psychological pattern interrupt, the functional outcome in the room is identical: internal regulation. Taking a deep breath stimulates the vagus nerve, which is a known physiological tool for lowering heart rate and signaling safety to the body. Pairing that breath with a focusing phrase gives the brain a specific microtask that distracts it from the immediate threat response.
So it works either way.
Yes. The Quiet Arsenal framework is taking a highly effective, scientifically validated psychological mechanism and wrapping it in a deeply resonant spiritual context. It gives it immense weight and personal purpose for the executive.
It anchors the pattern interrupt in something larger than just trying to calm down, and they pair this Nehemiah pause with another tool specifically designed for the micro moments of the day, what they call the gap moments. This is strategy number 6. The Joshua boundary.
Right. The Joshua boundary relies on the text of Joshua 1.8, which gives a mandate to the newly appointed leader of a nation, instructing that this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night.
And what's the modern application?
The modern executive problem this strategy explicitly targets is the feeling of being spiritually dry, or realizing midweek that you have completely lost touch with your foundational why.
Which is a constant hazard when you are just grinding through the Gideon audit tasks. You are executing, but you feel completely disconnected from the purpose.
Exactly. So the physical application of the Joshua boundary is surprisingly tactile. The curriculum instructs the leader to physically write one single King James verse on a paper index card and keep it in their pocket throughout the workday.
A physical piece of paper. In an era where every executive has an Apple Watch, an iPhone, and an iPad, the mandate is a paper index card.
The analog physicality is the entire point. You are instructed to physically pull out this paper card and read it specifically during transition moments. The workbook explicitly mentions waiting at red lights during a commute or the 30 seconds you spend riding in an elevator between floors.
If you think about human behavior, what does every single one of us do in an elevator or at a long red light?
Pull out the phone.
Every time. You instinctively pull out your smartphone. You check the news headlines. You refresh your inbox. You look at Slack. You look for a dopamine hit.
Yes, you doom scroll.
Yeah.
You fill the gap with external noise. The Joshua boundary is architected to aggressively replace that default digital consumption of fear-based news or work stress with intentional structured meditation.
Setting a boundary against the noise.
Exactly. It acts as a literal boundary against the constant overwhelming influx of the modern information cycle. It ensures that in those tiny, mundane 30-second gaps in your schedule, the default mode network of your brain is being fed a grounding ancient principle rather than absorbing a new manufactured anxiety from the internet.
It all comes back to internal regulation. You are taking active agency over what feeds your neurochemistry in those idle seconds. And, that concept of intense internal regulation is the perfect bridge to what I think are the most demanding, deeply foundational disciplines in this entire framework.
Oh, without a doubt.
We are moving from the micro habits of elevators and boardroom pauses into the macro mindsets that govern a leader's entire worldview.
This is where the curriculum separates the merely efficient managers from the truly anti-fragile leaders. We are looking at how to regulate the internal environment when the external environment is completely on fire.
Strategy number 5 is called the Paul thermostat. And the subtitle attached to this strategy in the materials is an absolute gut punch to modern sensibilities. It says, contentment is a muscle.
The theological anchor here is Philippians 4.11:13. This is a letter written by the Apostle Paul while he was literally sitting in a prison cell facing potential execution,
Which is a pretty bad state to be in.
to say the least. And he writes, I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. The specific word the Quiet Arsenal framework latches onto and highlights is learned. Yes. Paul did not say he magically felt content about being in prison. He said he learned how to be content. Therefore, the curriculum frames contentment not as a fleeting emotion or a personality trait, but as a rigid, learned skill. It is a psychological muscle that will atrophy if it isn't actively subjected to resistance training.
The notes have this one line that completely disrupted my normal way of thinking about executive reward systems. They write, joy is strategic.
Such a great line.
It entirely inverts the corporate paradigm. Usually, joy is positioned as the reward at the end of the tunnel. You hit the quarterly goal, you secure the massive client bonus, you crush the competition, and then you feel joy.
Right.
But this methodology argues that joy isn't the reward. It is the active strategy you must deploy to survive the brutal process of leadership.
It's a profound shift in perspective. If your internal joy or peace is tied entirely to external metrics, like a flawlessly green balance sheet or high polling approval ratings or a successful product launch, then your joy is, by definition, completely fragile.
Because things always change.
Exactly. Because the exact second those external metrics dip, and they always will, markets crash, polls drop,
Yeah.
your internal stability instantly collapses with them.
So how do you actually train this muscle? What is the physical daily routine for the Paul thermostat?
It's prescribed as a very specific morning ritual. Before you officially start your workday, before you open a single email, you are instructed to clearly identify and look at your current state,
Even if it's bad.
especially if it's bad. This might be confronting a terrible financial burn rate, acknowledging an active HR crisis in your department, or looking at syncing approval numbers. You look directly, unblinkingly at the bad news.
Okay.
And then you must declare aloud, this is the state the Lord has made. You must actively choose to practice rejoicing before you engage with fixing the work.
The analogy embedded right in the name of this strategy, the Paul thermostat, is brilliant. It perfectly isolates the difference between being a thermometer and being a thermostat in a corporate environment.
Right, think about a thermometer.
A thermometer just hangs passively on the wall and reacts to the temperature of the room. If the boardroom is panicked and hot, the mercury goes up. If the market is freezing and cold, the mercury goes down. It has absolutely no agency.
None.
But a thermostat has agency. It reads the room, but it sets the temperature. It regulates the environment around it.
That analogy is the absolute core of anti-fragility within this framework. It is the refusal to let external, uncontrollable crises dictate your internal peace. You set the temperature of your own spirit, regardless of the chaos unfolding in the boardroom. If the leader is a thermostat, the panic of the organization eventually cools to match the calm of the leader.
But I have to push back hard on this one because this sounds incredibly close to a modern psychological trap.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Right. If you tell a deeply anxious CEO to just look at a catastrophic balance sheet, maybe a balance sheet that means they have to lay off 200 people on Friday, and you tell them to rejoice at that state, isn't that veering dangerously into toxic positivity? Isn't that just deep, dangerous denial wrapped up nicely in a Bible verse?
That is the most common and valid critique of this specific strategy by far. The line between strategic contentment and toxic positivity can appear incredibly thin.
Very thin.
However, the curriculum provides a vital clarification here. This isn't about ignoring the crisis, pasting on a fake smile, or pretending the catastrophic balance sheet is actually a blessing in disguise.
Okay, so what is it?
It's entirely about ensuring that the crisis doesn't dictate your fundamental discipline. You fully acknowledge the grim reality of the bad state, but you stubbornly refuse to let the existence of that problem destroy your inner man before you even begin the hard work of solving it. It is the ultimate equivalent of securing your own emotional oxygen mask first before assisting the rest of the plane.
Securing the oxygen mask so you have the breath to actually fight the fire. I
Yeah.
like that. Which leads us to the absolute bedrock of their entire protocol, the strategy that everything else is built upon. Strategy number one, the Daniel Protocol.
Ah, yeah.
Subtitle here is uncompromising. Fixed knees, not feelings.
This protocol is based on the narrative in Daniel 6.10. Daniel is a high-ranking, incredibly powerful government official in the Babylonian Empire. He is suddenly faced with a politically orchestrated, literal death penalty crisis, a decree that anyone who prays to anyone but the king will be thrown into a den of lions.
A literal life or death crisis.
Exactly. But the biblical text notes a staggering detail. When Daniel heard the decree, he went to his house and prayed as he did aforetime, meaning the introduction of a life-threatening, massive external crisis did not alter his daily, mundane internal discipline by a single degree.
He didn't panic pray. He didn't call an emergency spiritual board meeting. He just kept his existing routine.
Exactly. The Daniel Protocol is specifically designed to target modern leaders who suffer from 3 a.m. anxiety, the ones who wake up in a cold sweat thinking about payroll, and leaders whose chaotic schedules entirely own them.
So how does it work?
The structural mandate here is arguably the most rigorous in the entire program. The executives must establish 3 fixed, non-negotiable windows for prayer every single day, 6 a.m., 12 p.m., and 9 p.m.
3 times a day, permanently hard-coded into the calendar, no matter what.
No matter what. Each of these 3 sessions must last for a minimum of 3 minutes. There can be absolutely no cellular device, tablet, or smartwatch present in the room to ensure zero digital interruption. And during those 3 minutes, the executive is instructed to focus their mind entirely on Psalm 23.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
Yes. And the Quiet Arsenal methodology makes an incredible, measurable biological claim regarding this practice. They state that committing to this specific, fixed routine for just 7 consecutive days, regardless of how anxious you feel or what massive corporate emergency unexpectedly pops up at 11:55 a.m., creates a tangible physiological reduction in baseline cortisol levels.
They are attempting to lower the body's primary stress hormone through forced, scheduled, analog quiet. Think about the psychology of that midday window. By forcing the leader to walk away from their desk at exactly 12 p.m., even if the building feels like it's on fire.
Which it often does.
Right. It forces them to repeatedly prove to their own nervous system that the world will not actually end if they are unreachable for 3 minutes.
It is the ultimate dominance play over your own calendar. It proves to the executive subconscious that they own their schedule. The schedule does not own them. It breaks the illusion of indispensability.
So we have walked through all 7 of these distinct strategies. We've gone from the biological mandate of sleeping and eating to the micro habit of pausing before speaking to the macro discipline of scheduled daily prayer.
It's a comprehensive system.
It really is. And what makes this framework so unusually compelling is that it doesn't just throw these concepts out as abstract motivational philosophy. They don't just tell you to be more like Elijah. They package every single one of these ancient ideas into a highly structured, aggressively trackable modern system.
Yes, the tracking sheet.
Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the actionable plan.
This is where the ancient theology violently collides with modern corporate execution. The sources outline a literal, tangible battle plan in the form of a document called the 7-Day Anti-Fragile Leadership Protocol Tracking Sheet.
Quite a title.
It is a literal daily and weekly checklist designed to ensure these ancient disciplines are actually executed in the reality of a modern executive's workflow.
Let's break down exactly what is on this checklist. If you are listening to this deep dive right now and want to implement this entire framework tomorrow morning, what does your day actually look like on this piece of paper?
The daily checklist requires the executive to hit 5 specific, trackable checkpoints every 24 hours. First is the Daniel Protocol. Did you hit your 3 fixed prayer windows at 6 a.m., 12 p.m., and 9 p.m. for 3 uninterrupted minutes with absolutely no phone in the room?
Check.
Second is the Paul thermostat. Did you start your morning by confronting your current state, whatever fires are currently burning, and actively practice rejoicing before you opened your inbox?
That's a hard one, but check.
Third is the Joshua boundary. Did you carry your physical paper index card and actively read your chosen verse during transition moments instead of doom scrolling at red lights or in elevators?
Check.
Fourth is the Nehemiah pause. Did you successfully deploy that 2-second whispered prayer? Lord, give me lips like a sword in the gap before responding to a conflict or a hostile email. And fifth is the Elijah refeed. Did you prioritize your physical recovery? Did you eat real, substantial food? Actively avoid clinical impairment by securing sufficient sleep and forcefully turn off your phone to stop the adrenaline hijack.
So that is the daily rhythm. 5 non-negotiable check marks every single day to keep the battery charged. And then overlaid on top of that is the weekly checklist.
Yes, the weekly checklist involves 2 major structural audits that must be completed to ensure the organization isn't crushing the individual. First is the Gideon audit. Did you sit down, review your calendar, rigorously identify your unique 3 tasks, and actively send home, cut, or delegate all the other peripheral noise?
Doing the hard pruning.
Exactly. And second, the Sabbath siege. Did you successfully observe one full, continuous 24-hour period of total disconnection?
Yeah.
No strategic decisions, no Slack messages, no reviewing documents?
It is genuinely wild to look at the source material and see, meditate on Psalm 23, sitting right next to eat a steak, and ruthlessly audit your task list on the exact same executive tracking sheet.
It's an unusual juxtaposition for sure.
It completely redefines what leadership training and resilience coaching looks like. It is seamlessly synthesizing spiritual endurance with harsh physiological and structural reality.
And the overarching promise the curriculum makes to anyone who commits to tracking this 7-day sprint is profound. They claim that if you execute this checklist with absolute discipline, the result isn't just that you might feel a little more relaxed or centered at work.
It's deeper than that.
Much deeper. The explicit promise is a literal physiological drop in cortisol, the elimination of the adrenaline hijack, and the active rebuilding of the inner man. You are fundamentally repairing the foundation so the skyscraper doesn't collapse under its own weight.
It has clearly resonated because it's becoming a full-on movement. The notes mention a whole ecosystem of supplementary materials offered by the Quiet Arsenal.
Oh yeah, they have a lot.
They have printed flashcards for the specific KJV verses, an entire interactive workbook hosted on Gumroad. They generate customized executive assessment reports. They even have an inside joke line of merchandise.
The mug.
Yes. They literally sell a Juniper Tree Survivor coffee mug, which, if you know the narrative of Elijah desperately wanting to die under that tree, having a mug sitting on your desk that says you survived it is a darkly funny, incredibly niche flex for a burnt-out executive.
It really is. But that mug highlights a critical sociological reality. This framework addresses a massive shared pain point. There is an entire silent subculture of high-level leaders, CEOs, founders, politicians who are experiencing this exact paralyzing type of spiritual attrition.
They're suffering in silence.
They have the money, they have the power, but they are hollow. The merchandise isn't just a product line, it's a physical acknowledgement of the shared, often unspoken trauma of bearing the weight of leadership.
It's endlessly fascinating to me how these ancient, thousands of years old King James Version scriptures texts written in agrarian societies and ancient empires are being directly and effectively mapped onto the ultra-modern, hyper-connected anxieties of Slack notifications, late-night doom scrolling, and 247 news cycle burnout.
It's a bizarre bridge, but it works.
It is ancient hardware running modern software, and somehow the code compiles perfectly.
What that suggests is that while the speed of our technology and the scale of our corporations have changed exponentially, the fundamental biological fragility of the human spirit under immense pressure has not changed one bit.
We're still the same humans.
Exactly. The baseline need for profound internal intake to balance massive external output is a timeless, inescapable human reality.
Let's zoom out and summarize this entire journey. We have explored a truly unique, highly rigid framework today. The Quiet Arsenal methodology treats spiritual stamina not as some vague, ethereal feeling you hope to achieve on a yoga retreat, but as a measurable, actionable, daily leadership metric.
Which is a huge paradigm shift.
It really is. We've seen how avoiding the sin of sleep deprivation with the Elijah refeed is the mandatory first step. We've examined how aggressively pruning your tasks like Gideon protects your operational focus. We've looked at how setting unyielding boundaries like the Daniel Protocol and using the Nehemiah pause actively rewires your neurobiology and stops the amygdala hijack.
It covers all the bases.
It is a full system, body and spirit reset designed to take a brittle, fragile leader and forge them into an anti-fragile one.
And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave everyone listening with a final thought to ponder. A question that builds on the brutal structural reality of everything we've unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
The curriculum argues forcefully that if the leader breaks, the entire ship sinks. Your internal unseen resilience is the actual literal structural integrity of your organization. So if your company's, your campaigns, or your family's entire survival ultimately depends on your personal baseline endurance, What is the actual tangible, catastrophic cost of the next hour of sleep you decide to sacrifice for the job?
Wow. What is the actual cost of that next sacrificed hour? That is the question you have to answer. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, fiercely protect your intake, and go build something that doesn't break.